I saw a stat saying that between 2000 and 2025, something like that, about 7 Premier teams have been involved in such a matter. Why don't we hear about these things as much as possible?
I think, I think before we even get to that, I think when we talk about cases of sexual abuse and rape being part of that group, we need to take the utmost care, as there will be victims, of this deplorable act who never got justice, or for whom justice was delayed, and they are traumatized for the rest of their lives, as well as there will be alleged perpetrators whose lives would have been adversely impacted, and who maybe down the line were not found guilty. And Benjamin Mendy springs to mind. I have no doubt that the case we're going to discuss of Thomas Partey, as an example, relating to what you were just talking about, the silence of the media, why this is not spoken about, would have affected a number of people, including those directly involved or indirectly involved, or people not involved at all in this particular case, but people who have somehow in their lives been affected by cases of rape and sexual abuse in particular, or sexual abuse and rape in particular. Having researched this case a little bit, I have no doubt, looking at the chronology, that it would have affected the relationship between the player and the Premier League and the FA, and most importantly, the player's employer, in this case, Arsenal Football Club.
But Arsenal is not, yeah. Arsenal is not the only. Arsenal is not the only club, right? It's not the isolated case here. So that's why my question was like, why don't we hear more about this? Because it's not only Arsenal.
Yeah,
there are many other clubs involved. Yeah,
absolutely. I was just building up to this, and I also want to say that if you have been a victim of sexual abuse or rape in the UK, which is where I live, you can contact a rape crisis for support in the UK. I do not know which agencies you have in the USA. And if you're in Africa, because we are an African football platform, speak to someone, speak to authorities. Yes, in this particular case involving rape and sexual abuse in the UK, as you rightly say, it's not spoken about a lot. We know that there were reports of 2 19-year-olds Premier League players who were being investigated or who were arrested in connection with alleged rape, and they were both released on bail. And the BBC carried out an investigation in November 2023, which found out that these 2 players carried on playing for the Premier League, and there was also a boss. The report just says one of the bosses who was also under investigation. This was not mentioned. So we do not even know who they're talking about. And they also found out that 7 out of 20 Premier League clubs had players who have been under investigation for rape and sexual abuse since 2020. But again, silence. And this brings us down to the question which you were asking. Why is this not spoken about in the UK or in the media? This is because of privacy rules in the UK, where suspects in criminal investigations generally have a reasonable expectation of privacy, what we call the Article 8 rights. And that's the European Convention for Human Rights, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to privacy, the right to family life and privacy. So privacy is under that. And I think here, the main issue, is that you cannot disclose this information or disclose the person under investigation until they are charged, because the implications for them could be so enormous. And you only have to think about Benjamin Mendy, for example. I know Benjamin Mendy wasn't mentioned until he was charged, but even after being charged, he was cleared. So it is really difficult. And so if you look back, like they say that this alleged incidents occurred between 2021 and 2022 and were first reported in 2022. And the media actually spoke about it in 2022, but no one was named. They only went as far as saying that this person was arrested or was taken into custody in Barnet. Now, once you say Barnet, that's North London, and it became some of a joke online with people responding to, I hope it's a Spurs player. I hope it's an Arsenal player. But people were mentioning those names, those clubs, but no one could actually exactly say, because if you start pinpointing a particular club, it would have been easier for someone to be identified. And you just don't know, because they said the person was 29 years old, the person played for a Premier League club, and the person was an international. Now, all you needed to do was to look at the roster of both clubs, and then you could narrow it down to particular individuals who fall within that age category and who also play international football. So
Yeah.
what I would so that just boils down to that, it's privacy rules. This information cannot be disclosed until the person is charged.
Okay. So I remember in 2021, as you said, that's some 2021-22, I was in Florida. I think we were in Florida. And after that period, I went back to Florida to Orlando. And when I was in an Uber, I heard this Uber driver, she was a lady, she was an Arsenal fan. And she told me like directly that Partey had been accused of these things, right? And then I heard about it.
She called a name.
Yeah, she talked about it. She said Partey was accused of things like that. And I looked at her and I was like, oh wow, then I need to check up. I need to check, check on it and stuff like that. But before we continue, in the USA, right, if you're involved in such things, you can directly contact RAINN, which is spelled RAINN, which stands for Rape, Abuse, and Innocence National Network. So those are some organizations. If you're involved in things like that, you can actually directly contact them. But I do also remember here we're talking about sports, right? So here in the USA, a famous assistant coach, and that was Jerry Sandusky in the college football. He was accused. He has a scandal that went around 3 decades, and he was coaching under this this legendary coach, and he was accused of about 45 to 48 charges of child abuse. Yes, of child abuse, and that was in college football. So you know how some of these things, because it's not actually today, right? And it's not only in the professional. We can talk about like in the lower levels. We talk about child abuse. Even I remember this case in Cameroon of child abuse. I mean, all these football schools and stuff like that. So these are things that plague our football. But because the sports have so much money, and it just overshadows some of these things. And as you say, it's a sensitive topic, And then it's a very, very sensitive topic where you must actually give it or let the professionals deliberate about the complexity of these things.
Yes, and I think, I didn't consider that in terms of this particular case that we want to discuss today, but yes. When you talk about child sexual abuse, that has been an issue in English football. And a few years back, some individuals were charged and banned for football, and some are serving prison time. So there was a huge investigation going back into the 80s, I think even 70s, about senior citizens who were abused while they were in academies in those days, and even recently. And when I say recently, I mean a few years back, safeguarding policies now are different. And we will talk about that in a minute when we explore in detail the situation surrounding Thomas Partey at the moment.
So these were not only players, right? Because in the 7 of 20 EPL teams that were involved since 2020 in the investigation that BBC did, it was also involving managers and staffs.
Yeah.
So we are not only talking about players here.
No. We're not only talking about players. And I think when we talk about abuse, it involves everyone. Everyone is involved. Safeguarding is everyone's mission, you know. So and in terms of the abuse itself, you know, different people can commit these crimes. You know, we're not saying that our subject of discussion today has done anything, but he is the accused of these crimes. So, but yes, it involves managers, it involves senior executive officers, it involves everyone, you know. So there are people up the ladder of power in football who have been involved in this and who have been accused of it, but we don't know who they are, and they've never been charged. So that's it ends there. And maybe they didn't commit these crimes, you know, but you know, we cannot talk about them.
Okay,
before
we continue, I'd like to say shout out to Ashubi-san and to Fred Agami. Fred is your South African friend who now lives in London, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's my man from way back, from Coop Top or Cop Top.
So as I was saying, right, you just mentioned the name earlier of Benjamin Mendy. I was having this conversation because when the case of Partey came up, we had different conversations, and there are some people who are frustrated, not because they think these guys are actually not guilty, but because they say some of these players are targeted. And when they are targeted, like the case of Benjamin Mendy, after 2 years, we realized that he did not actually commit these crimes, but the damage is already done.
That is exactly the reason why this privacy rule exists. That you must not disclose this information, you know, because unless the person is charged, you know, you cannot disclose this information. And even after the person is charged, they are not guilty. You know, they are still just an accused. It still has to be proven, and the burden of proof is on the accuser.
Okay, yes, I do understand that. But what about the case of Benjamin Mendy, where he comes out, he was not guilty, he actually did not do anything wrong, but then nothing happens to the person who accused him of?
Well, the person who accuses you is broke. So what do you do? Because your reputation is broken. You know, financially, you're financially ruined. Your career is ruined. You lose everything. You know, but there's no way for you getting it back, because who are you going to get it from? You know, if you were accused by someone who is equally as powerful and as rich as you, it's a different story. But even the financial benefits from it, or whatever you gain in terms of compensation, will never take away the emotional impact this is going to have on you. You know, we had a case recently in the UK where a senior member of the cabinet was accused of sexual abuse. And this man he was proven not guilty, but he ended up committing suicide, you know. So it is significant, and which is why I say this subject that we're discussing today does affect people significantly. And that's why we're sending out, you know, the information to say, look, if you're listening to this, or if you come across this video, please be aware that you can contact Rape Crisis in the UK for support, because it's quite significant. Because it's like a bereavement. When you're bereaved, every time someone else close to you is bereaved, you know, it affects you to a level, because you start thinking about your own experience, and that's the way trauma works. So you have to find the coping mechanisms to cope with it for the rest of your life.
And it's good that you just mentioned trauma, because I just told you 2 days ago when I heard about Jota's death and all that. He's not a player that I'll normally watch, right, playing for Liverpool. I don't support Liverpool. However, just because of the way we as fans relate to these players, we take it personal. Yes. It affected my whole day. And yesterday, when the funeral proceedings were going on, I could not even watch because I didn't want to see that. You know, so that's some type of trauma, and it's good that you actually brought this up, because everywhere I opened, every feed that I opened yesterday on my social media was about Thiago Jota.
Yeah, he was a much loved guy, you know, and even those of us who were opposing fans, you know, we dreaded Jota. If Liverpool was losing and you saw Diogo Jota standing on the touchline, you know, man, there's trouble coming your way. He just always seemed to come on and cause a lot of trouble for opposition teams, you know. He was such a great footballer to watch, very active, rapid, you know, and clinical. You know, we will all miss him, even though he wasn't part of my team, but he was a player I like watching, you know. So such a sad story.
Yeah, very likable guy. And
Yes.
before we actually talk about Thomas Partey, can you talk a little bit to his profile? 32 years old, left Ghana, went to Atletico Madrid. So that those who actually who don't know who Thomas Partey is should actually put, you know.
Yeah, it's again, you know, these incidents or these stories lead us to do some more research. And I never knew that Thomas Partey first was a player of Leganes. So he came to Spain through Leganes, and he was only there for a season. And I don't think he finished the season even. But then he joined Atletico Madrid after that. And as we know, and he was at Atletico Madrid, can you believe it, for 7 years?
Oh, yeah.
You know, he was at Atletico Madrid for 7 years, and he also he was loaned out a few times. So loaned out to Mallorca, loaned out to Almeida, before exploding, you know, within the Atletico team, leading to alerting Arsenal and other big European clubs to take out their wallets, you know. And he arrived at Arsenal with a reputation because this guy was so good for Atletico Madrid, and he signed a 5-year contract, which is now ended. And Thomas Partey was hoping to move on to new ventures, but again, we shall come to that. But given his age, it is very unlikely that we would get to watch Thomas Partey play again. He has been capped, I think, 50 times or more for Ghana and scored 14 goals. And I'm very sure Thomas Partey was hoping to captain Ghana to the World Cup in 2026. How that pans out, I do not know.
Yeah, and as should be some comment, it just says sometimes we lose sight of the emotional impact these kind of situations have on our people or on people, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, it's damaging because when you come, you go through such scrutiny. Because when you're accused of such serious things, they're gonna scrutinize your life. You're gonna be in the media. Look at what's happening here in the USA. You know, P. Diddy. I know his own way more like, I mean, to the extreme. You know, for some of us who are actually watching or reading the news, but there's so much scrutiny. Even those who did not directly involve themselves in the crimes, when they call you, you know, over as part of a person of interest, you know, your life is going to be out there in the media, you know. So psychologically, you will definitely need some help. You'll need some mental, because it's going to affect you one way or the other. But let me ask you this question, right? Because we know how football is mentally, you know, can be mental and psychologically strong. What do you make of this? Because this has been going for 3 years, but we saw the guy still playing for Arsenal. Arsenal keeping this on it because he was bailed about 7 times. You know, every time, I mean, maybe they call him for, you know, questioning and stuff like that. He comes back, he's bailed. So, I mean, mentally, this demands some mental strength in order to go through 3 years, and you don't know what's going to happen. Are the charges going to finally come? And the timing of these charges, it's just when his contract is about to finish. Maybe he's about to leave the country. So those accusing him, I'm like, okay, this is the moment, you know, to strike.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think when it comes to bail, what happens is that when he was spoken to the first time, and he was released on bail, what happens in the UK, and I would suppose that's what happens in the USA, is that when you're released on bail, you have to answer bail. And by answering bail doesn't mean that they're going to speak to you every time. But you simply turn up and they will tell you, we're renewing your bail again. It doesn't mean they speak to you again about the case. They can speak to you many times when you're still under bail conditions. But the thing is, on that particular day that the bail expires, so if your bail, for example, was expiring on, say, the 7th of August, you turn up on the 7th of August, they renew. It takes only a few minutes. They renew your bail. They say, okay, investigation is still ongoing, so we're going to renew your bail for a further 3-month period. And you do that. So that's how it comes to say, oh, he was bailed seven times. But actually, that's not how it works. They just renew the bail until the case is closed or until you are charged. And what happens with that is the bail comes with conditions. So it will say things that you can and cannot do. And specifically in relation to cases of sexual abuse, they will put some conditions around how you relate with women or potential victims. And in this case, it will be women. If you remember, again, going back to Benjamin Mendy's case, he was released on bail and there were conditions, and then he was rearrested because he breached bail. He went back into activity. So, sorry, I'm laughing when I shouldn't, because this is a serious matter, but this is just what happens, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that, yes. So you're given bail conditions and you should not breach them, and you have to answer bail and come back and talk about it with the investigators. Yeah.
From an Arsenal,
yes.
From an Arsenal point of view, do you think they actually learned something from the way Manchester City handled the case with Benjamin Mendy, or is this one just a little bit different because of maybe the differences in the case? Because Partey's own, it came out, and then there's some doubt. We don't know, the details of the case. I mean, the way the case is taking its time. Did they learn something? Did Arsenal as a club learn something from the case with Benjamin Mendy and Manchester City?
I want to think so. Especially if you look at this case, there were four ladies. There were 4 victims who came forward, but only 3 are left. So 4 ladies were spoken to, only 3 are left. So the Crown Prosecution Service would have done some background work. And I'm sure in doing that work, they would have been speaking to Arsenal as well. And the fact that one of the cases was dropped would have affected the way I think the employer and the prosecution worked with the alleged perpetrator. So yes, I want to think that they would have considered the facts of that case. Normally, in situations like this, forensics will be involved. And when I say forensics in this case, not in terms of human, I mean in terms of technology. They would usually scan phones. They would usually go through your phones to look at communication with the player, between you and other people, as is related to the matter. Now, we do not know if this has already taken place or not. We do not understand the details or the circumstances around which one of the cases or one of the alleged incidents was dropped or investigations was closed. So I don't know the details. We don't know the details yet. It would be interesting to find out later on down the line. But I would like to think that Arsenal would have learned something from what happened with Benjamin Mendy. There would have been question marks because, again, when we look at in detail, when we talk about in detail or the chronology of events, it will come out clearly, because of the communication between the FA and the victims, between the EPL and the victims, and between Arsenal. And there was kind of a bounce of information from this person, from this organization to that organization, leading to a lot of frustration for the victims or alleged victims in this case. So yes, I want to say that, I want to believe that everyone involved in this had considered or might have had some consideration for what happened in the Benjamin Mendy case.
Okay. And for those who don't know, from what I know, I've done some investigation. Partey is not actually married, but he welcomed a daughter last year, with a current girlfriend. I think she's British, right?
Yes, she is British.
Okay, by the name of Janina Maxson, and that's all we know about Thomas Partey so far as a relationship is concerned. So, you know, so he's not actually married.
No, he's not. At one point, he did say he changed his name. He changed his. He was dating a Moroccan lady, and he had to change his religion. I think he might have been coming to the point of engaging the lady to marry her and stuff like that, and he was required to change his religion. And apparently, he took the name Yakubu.
Yakubu, yeah.
But then he decided to renege on that and took back on his name, Thomas Partey, and then obviously he's now in a different relationship, so that didn't go ahead. I'm hoping, for the sake of our broadcast, that is a true story, but it's written out there, you know, in the open. So yeah.
Okay, so now in the case of Arsenal, we now realize that because everything is happening so fast, it was Thomas Partey about to get an extension. Then a day after, because the extension, it was announced that he's finally leaving Arsenal, right? And 2 days after, this news drops. The timing again, you know, because it's about timing. I'm trying to read what's going on. Did Arsenal really want to extend his contract, or are they now using? Did they actually just use excuses that he was trying to have an increase in salary in order to get rid of him? Was that an arrangement between them? Because they can come and say, okay, Partey, look, we cannot extend your contract because there's this case that is actually over your head, and he's been here for a while. I mean, what do you think?
Now, to really understand this, you know, I think it's good that we talk about the chronology of events. Okay, so August 2021, the first alleged victim reported to the police, and then contacted the FA and the Premier League. Yeah, and then a month later, the alleged victim informed the club about the allegations, and the club said it could not discuss the allegations for legal reasons, and asked the victim to contact the FA. And then 4 months after contacting the FA told the alleged perpetrator that no further action was being taken, as the alleged perpetrator, in this case Thomas Partey, as we now know, his behavior did not breach its regulations, you know, and there was no evidence to suggest that his behavior posed a risk to children or adults. And I must state here that the reason they said this was because their policies and their guidance concern risks to people within football, not within the community. Now, if you have those concerns, then it's the FA or the Premier League or Arsenal Football Club has to report it to the police. It's the police's responsibility. But they do their own risk assessment and due diligence on the risks involved within football itself. And they felt at the time that there wasn't that level of risk. And so they said, look, no further actions for us. You know, and then in July 2022, that was the first time he was called suspect, was arrested. And shortly afterwards, he was arrested again for another allegation of rape from a second woman, you know. And then he was questioned by the police again now in 2023 about the allegations of sexual assault made by a third woman. So the numbers kept going up. And then in 2024, a fourth lady has then come up, a victim has then come up. And again, he was spoken to by the police about this, you know. So as you can see, it's taken already almost 3 years. And within that time, we have 4 alleged victims, you know. Now, the first victim or the first alleged victim who reported this to the FA in August 2021 contacted the club in 2024, in July 2024, you know, and provided them with more evidence. And by this time, she was talking about the effects this has had on her, you know, and because, like they say, justice delayed is justice denied. And we know from cases like this that there are a lot of victims who have suffered and decided to just close the case and suffer in silence, you know. And at this point, Arsenal said, look, we've passed all this to the Premier League and to the FA. And this is what I'm saying to you, that information was bouncing between the FA and the Premier League and Arsenal Football Club, you know. So, and everyone was talking about the safeguarding policies, you know, and this led to a frustration from the alleged victims. Now, coming to, if you look at this, if you look at this chronology, there is no way you would say that the football club wasn't really aware of the details of the case, because, like I say, it is very likely that the prosecution would have been sharing information with solicitors, with the club's own solicitors, and with the club, you know. And then when it now came to contractual negotiations, you know, we all know that Thomas Partey is 32 years old. These are professionals, so they know how to sign players. It's very rare in the Premier League for a 32-year-old to get their contracts prolonged, especially midfielders. And if in any case, it will usually be a year, and they would renew on a year-on-year basis. And we were told that they were looking for, or Thomas Partey was looking for ways to increase his wage demands. Now, I know I did some research on this, and this came out. This was done. What I found done by other analysts was they looked at Thomas Partey's performances in the last few years, and they used this as a reason why Arsenal would most likely not offer a new contract to Thomas Partey. They said his passes into the final third had dropped from 8.3 to 6.93 to 5.4. So consecutively in 3 seasons. Pass completion dropped from last season to this season from 89% to 87%. Passes to in games or per game from 72% to 61%. Shot creating actions per 90 minutes from 2.86 to 2. Blocks per 90 minutes from 1.02 to 0.93. Interceptions from 1.25 to 1.3. Tackles lost went from 0.57, to 0.96. So the data wasn't in favor of Thomas Partey staying. But you and I know that data is one thing. But when you look at the game, we all know that when Thomas Partey was not playing for Arsenal, Arsenal was struggling in midfield in terms of maintaining possession and in their play. And we saw that in his absence against Paris Saint-Germain in the first leg of the Champions League. And also when he got the second yellow card in the quarterfinals, you know, some of his teammates, particularly Declan Rice, wasn't happy because they knew that they wouldn't have Thomas Partey for the first leg of the semi-finals. And the first leg is usually very important because at least you can take a draw, and it changes the way you play generally over the 2 legs. So it's better for you to play the first leg and miss the second leg than miss the first leg, because the first leg would determine how you play your second leg game. You know, so whilst this data is showing that Thomas Partey was in decline and he was getting older, I do not think it was the final nail in his coffin, in the coffin of his of a new contract offer. Because if this data was decisive, as the analysts are claiming, why was Arsenal having further discussions with Thomas Partey for whatever reason? You know, I do not believe this. I do not believe this. And if you look at, again, if you start including the chronology of the discussions as we were reading in papers for a new contract offer, and the timing of when that decision was made, and the timing of the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police releasing this information and naming Thomas Partey as the accused or the alleged accused or whatever, it smells, it stinks. And I can only think that the only reason that Arsenal did not renew that contract was because Thomas Partey was charged. Now, we do not know the date exactly. What we know is when it was disclosed to the public that this player had been charged. But I would want to think that it could have been a week or two before it was discussed or disclosed. And I want to believe that that is what led to Arsenal not renewing his contract. Or it could have been a factor amongst other factors, including the performance data we just spoken about.
Yeah, I think the performance data had nothing to do with that, because not only did Thomas Partey's stats go down, when you also watch the way Arsenal play, Arsenal also had digressed. They actually go down. So it was not only isolated to the case of Thomas Partey. And secondly, I also want to believe that it's because of this case, and Arsenal was just trying to shift the responsibility actually where it belonged, you know. And I think, did Arsenal, if I ask myself, could Arsenal have done things the other way around? I think Arsenal was in their right, in order to, to just let justice, take its course, especially when, Thomas Partey was not already charged, because some people will be asking, why did Arsenal not take the Manchester City's route, where they threw Mendy out of the team, did not pay his salary and stuff like that. Those are two different cases. I actually think Arsenal has dealt with the matter so far. From what we know, they have dealt with the matter the way they could have dealt with it. But as we continue to talk about this case, right, I want to talk about the cultural aspect of things. What some of these African footballers, it's not that it's isolated only to the African footballers, right? But culturally, because if you see Thomas Partey, right, if you see his demeanor, the way he carries himself, hey, you are looking at a clean-cut guy, a guy who never speaks, a guy you never hear him in the news and stuff like that. But when something like this happens, how can the others learn from a situation like this? Because Mendy, you can say Mendy was, it's his lifestyle. He did not commit any crime. You could say Mendy was reckless. You understand? Because he was having so many parties, going places like that. So you could say he was reckless and people took advantage of him. But a guy like Thomas Partey, you don't hear about him. And all of a sudden, you see something like this in the news.
It is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because, like you say, this is a guy who is quiet. You watch him on the pitch, it's like he barely even communicates or talks. And if there was one player, I would say you would not associate with things like this in Arsenal or African players in the Premier League, it would be Thomas Partey and maybe someone like Mo Salah. People who are quiet, who know outspoken. They only speak when it's necessary to speak. So it is a difficult one, and it would be an interesting case to watch. Us being an African platform, I can tell all our viewers that, goodness gracious me, I am going to follow this like I've never followed anything before. So please do join us in seeing how this pans out, because, and in doing this, we will always consider the victims. And in terms of culturally, I do not know how to situate this, apart from looking at it from the perspective of sportsmen and issues around sexual abuse. We know that they are targeted. We've seen the case with Neymar, which was a terrible thing to see. What if Neymar didn't have that video, that recording? What if that hotel room, what if there was no evidence to save him from those accusations? And I can tell you that there are criminal organizations out there, organizations that would target footballers. My view has always been, that a footballing career is short, and that footballers should play their football. It is fortunate or unfortunate that you might not want to have a long-term relationship until your career is over. Yes, but most football careers are over before you reach 30. You can still have casual relationships in a way that that person will never, ever know that you were a professional footballer until at some point where they gain your trust and you gain their trust, even though it's very difficult these days with social media. But some footballers have managed to do that. So I don't really know in terms of, I would rather say ethnic minority than to say cultural. Because if you look back just a few years, if you look at the players that have been mired with such accusations, like I said, I've just named a few players. What do you see about them? You know, they are in some way ethnic minorities. Neymar, Kylian Mbappe, Benjamin Mendy. Now we have Thomas Partey. You know, and even when you looked at the Benjamin Mendy cases, those parties, he was not alone. There were other Premier League footballers in those parties who had relationships with other women. You know, they were never questioned. You know, so I'm not saying that it looks like they are being targeted, but again, you know, they would look for people who are vulnerable, and the same as some of these people who are alleged accusers, they will also look for women who are vulnerable. I think, I'm not sure exactly, but when you look at this case, at the time these offenses were reported, some of these ladies were 19 and 20. You know, so I don't know about all of the others or the other ladies, how old they were. Wow. So we're talking about young ladies here who are not as experienced, you know, and who would not be able to make the right decisions at certain times. And one of the ladies, one of the alleged victims, actually said that if action had been taken by the police sooner, they would not have been abused, because the alleged perpetrator would have been named already, and she would have known that this person poses a risk of harm, and she wouldn't have found herself in that situation to be abused in the first place. So it's quite a complex situation, and it will be a good one to watch, you know. And this has significant implications for both the alleged victims and the alleged perpetrator. But in this case, you know, I think Thomas Partey is going to suffer a lot, you know, and the alleged victims would have suffered. But the only way you can actually talk about the alleged victim suffering is if the alleged perpetrator is found guilty of this, as we saw in the Benjamin Mendy case. You know, because yes, people would have been speaking about them being victims of abuse, about them suffering emotionally. But as we found out later, it was none of that. So it's very complicated now how you talk about them being victims and Thomas Partey being the alleged perpetrator. It's very difficult to balance the implications for all the parties, and we only have to wait to see how this pans out in the end, you know.
Okay, so what comes into mind, right? Thomas Partey is 32 years old. The events actually happening. He's at the point where he was out of contract with Arsenal. He still has to work because he's a professional footballer, right? And we know how the job of professional footballers are. You can sign in France, you can be all over the place. Do you think the system will allow him, let's say, if he's signed to go play in Saudi Arabia, will he be allowed to travel and go play in Saudi Arabia?
The first thing is, I will respond to you with a question: which club is going to sign him? No team is going to sign Thomas Partey in this situation at the moment. I think the ramifications for his career are huge. He will not even play for Ghana. He will not. I don't think so. And this case, again, if you look at Benjamin Mendy's case, cases in court take a snail pace. They are so slow because they are very important, and everything has to be, they have to work out a timetable for the case. And as new evidence comes out, the timetable would lengthen. Now, at least 2 years, he is 32 before this is over. The financial ramifications, we already know that it's been going on for 3 years. So for 2 years at least, but now 3, he would have already been putting a lot of resources into this just to keep it quiet, you know, just to keep it quiet and his rights respected, as well as the alleged victims would have been working hard to get him to answer the charges or the accusations against him, you know. So what I will say is we're looking at Benjamin Mendy, a situation where he is nailed on, guaranteed for ruins by the time this case is over. Even if Thomas Partey is found not guilty, the financial layout would ruin Thomas Partey, because this is high profile, this is high stakes. It's not for any kind of solicitor or barrister. This is going to be the top end of barristers and solicitors, you know. So I think the implications for him will be huge in terms of his career. In terms of his family relationship, I do not know. We know that he's not married, but Thomas Partey has a child. What does that mean? Child Protection Services will become involved, or would have been involved, as soon as his fiancée became pregnant. Now, we do not know if they live together. But again, when you have cases of allegations of sexual abuse and the person has a child, Child Protection Services will become involved. Now, we do not know the particular circumstances of that, but yes, definitely his family life would have been affected. Whether that relationship survives is another thing, you know. So the implications for him personally in terms of relationships, you know, it's going to be serious. You remember with Benjamin Mendy, he had to resort to borrowing money from his teammates to keep up with his life. You know, when I say keep up with his life, it's not the lifestyle. No, it's to pay his bills, it's to pay his solicitors, it's to pay his mortgage or his rent. You know?
Yeah, and this is more of a reason why people say, you know, those who come out and falsely accuse people should also be somehow punished, you know, by the law for making false statements. Because even if in the long run, let's say, right, we don't know that yet, that let's say Thomas Partey is not guilty of these crimes, yet he will be punished, at least financially, right? That for the next 2 years, or however the case, actually, he cannot work and make money in order to sustain those who depend on him.
Now, True Lion, one of the first things any law student or lawyer will tell you is that the law is not for the broke. If Partey was broke, this case would be dead long ago.
We don't know that.
In terms of solicitors being involved, the Crown Prosecution will still prosecute people who are accused of sexual offences. Do you understand what I mean? But
yeah.
When those people are broke, it remains where it needs to be within public proceedings. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But when it's a rich person, it's a different ballgame. Solicitors are all over it, you know. And what are they fighting for? The freedom and the liberty of the accused, and also the sufferings of the alleged victims. Now, do you think the alleged victim has the money to be paying for this?
No, but when
they've got the prosecution and the police behind them. Do you understand? The state behind them. Do you understand?
Yeah, but there should be also some ramifications if they make false statements. It must not always be money, right? It's like if somebody is going to jail, like Mendy spent time in jail, and those accusers were not the right one, then there should also be some punishment for those who come out to make false statements. That's what some people are saying.
If the law did that, let me ask you a question. How many victims will report crimes? Including the majority of cases where, you know, I think that would never happen. Forget about it. That would never happen. That would never happen. That would never happen. Because we're talking about...
Yeah, go ahead.
We're talking about victims here. That will never happen. The state has to protect victims. It's a safeguarding issue.
Of course.
The state has to protect victims. And they will never, I hear what you're saying. They will never look at it from that perspective that the victim, the alleged accused, but the alleged victim, you know, was only there for the money. Yes, we know there are some, but you have to look at every case for its merits. And you cannot just make a sweeping judgment to say when especially when we're talking about criminal proceedings, just because you are found not guilty doesn't mean it didn't happen. It could have happened, but it didn't happen exactly as the way you reported it. Do you understand what I'm saying? The facts of the matter and the details of the matter, when they are looking into it, your perception of it as a victim might not meet the threshold of what the law wants for that to be considered a crime, because you're taking away somebody's liberty and somebody's freedom. That is what we're looking at here. So the thresholds are very high. So you cannot say that, oh, and this is the difference, because sometimes in these cases, somebody could be found not guilty, but then they have to settle in a civil case. So you really don't have to, you cannot really say the law in this country or in any other democratic society would never look at that situation and say, we have to find a way of where we start punishing people who make these allegations. I think it's up to the police and the prosecution to look at cases and go, this is no further action. This stands no chance in court. And they have done that. It's not up to the victim. All the victim has to do is to report a crime to the police, what they perceive to be a crime. Then the police and the prosecution have their job, and their responsibility is to look at that allegation and determine whether it meets the threshold of crime and would stand the tests in court. It's not on the victim. That's not their responsibility. So that would never pass. That would never happen. That will never be considered.
Do you think football institutions should actually establish like independent mechanisms to help them when they have such cases that actually concerns injure their staff, their players, and all that? Or are there already such mechanisms that help, like a liaison between them and the police? Yeah.
No, there is. That's the police's role, isn't it? The crime has been reported to the police. The crime was reported first to the police, remember? But then the victim then went ahead. The police would normally contact if the police have the evidence, but the police don't have to. They have to look at it and consider whether it is relevant for them to inform the club, But the victim went ahead and reported it to the FA, to the Premier League, and to the club, as well as having reported it to the police. But that is for the police to investigate. I think there are those procedures and policies are already in place, But like the FA said, we are only looking at situations as concerning the football environment. That's what they said. In terms of the public, the general public, including the football environment, that's the responsibility for the police. And once the police start doing that, once the police start their investigation, it's up to the police to be communicating with all the other agencies, depending on the progress of the case. But the police also have responsibilities in terms of privacy, when they can disclose this information, And in terms of Arsenal as well, if Arsenal had known without the police knowing, they have to also look at their threshold to determine whether it warrants them telling the police. So there are policies and procedures already in place for these things, and each club has a safeguarding officer who is responsible for this, and they will also communicate with their solicitors, with their legal team within the team, to be able to make these decisions about how they go about investigating such things and the implications for the club and their employee as well.
So is it safe to say that Partey's footballing career is over?
I would say 99% yes. This is the end of Thomas Partey as a footballer. I would be surprised to see him play football again. But you never know. We have seen players like Paul Pogba suspended. We all thought he would never play again. Maybe Thomas Partey at 34, when this is over, if he is found not guilty, he could still be fit and he could sign for a club somewhere. I do not know. If he can prove his fitness at that age, when this is all over, if he is not charged, then he could play again. But how likely is that going to be? We have seen recently in the FIFA Club World Cup how football can be tough in Saudi Arabia. When we watch Al Hilal, it's no mean feat to play in Saudi Arabia, you know. And people think that it's easy to play in Asia. It is not. Maybe in some leagues, possibly. But you know, who would want to associate themselves with you? I do not know. But once, if at all, once and when, if he is proven not guilty, there are some clubs that could still like to have his services. If he can prove himself fit again to play. But I doubt it. I do not know. At the moment, I am on the side of, I don't think we will see him again. I do not know. It depends on a lot of factors which are not in his control at the moment.
How does this case, I know we talked a lot of time about Mendy, but the kid, Greenwood, who went to Marseille, how does his case actually compare to Thomas Partey? At least he did not go to charges were not pressed, right?
Well, I did not follow the details of that case, but he is still playing. So there was some level of, you know, there was some level of legal leeway with his case, which details of which I do not know. Otherwise, he wouldn't be playing. But what I can tell you, you look at his case, he did not even go to court. You know, and those charges were withdrawn, I think, if my memory, if I'm remembering the case well. But just the fact that he was accused, and he was named, and he was most likely, I think he would have been charged, because otherwise that would not have been in the media. But what I'm saying is just the fact that his name was in the media and that he was associated with the crime. No club in England want to touch his file. That's the way it is. You know, people respect this in the UK. People respect victims in the UK, victims' rights. You know, regardless, in some cases, regardless of whether you are proven guilty or not. Do you think Benjamin Mendy could not have signed in England? Do you think there were teams in England sincerely that did not want to sign Benjamin Mendy? You know, given all their sponsoring duties and responsibilities that they have, they do not want to get involved with people that will tarnish the images of the club. You know, they want to respect people's rights. They want to respect people's freedoms. And they don't want to associate themselves with people who have been associated with such crimes. So that is the reason why I feel it's going to be difficult for Thomas Partey. But again, as I said to you, as we have seen, in some cases, some of these players do come back, but the age is a factor here. And we do not know how long this is going to last. So give and take 2 years. And that's the reason why I feel it's going to be difficult for Partey to come back from this.
Okay. And what's the advice? I know it's actually difficult, right? But I mean, what can you advise, you know, some of these African players? And again, I know it's not isolated only to African players. You know, you barely see them in such type of news already. So a lot of them are already doing something great to keep themselves out of trouble. But I mean, what type of advice can you give some of these lads? I mean, when it comes to football and social events and how they actually live their life, you know?
It is very difficult. Like I said from the start, for me, it's my advice has always been to, when I speak to people in football, is that as a footballer, players need to really consider when it comes to relationships, what kind of relationships they get into. Now, what my view has always been, do not get in any serious relationship whilst you are playing football until you're coming towards the end of your career. Now, in terms, specifically speaking, in terms of African players, dating is not easy when you're in Europe. It can be a very lonely life when players are playing at this level, because every day is football. And when they do get the opportunity to socialize, it's very quick, flirt, have a quick relationship and go. But that quick relationship can lead you to somewhere like where Thomas Partey is now, because I do not think his interactions with these ladies were in terms of a long-term relationship. You know, so we do not understand the dynamics as we now know happened in Benjamin Mendy's situation. But usually with these footballers, they would have a pimp in their life, somebody who would connect them to ladies even when they go out, so they really need to consider where they're going out to, who they're partying with, occasions that they attend. And it's very unfortunate for them that they kind of somehow disconnect from their communities when they move abroad, because they find themselves usually in environments where it's multicultural, but it's more so they're dealing with people who are not from their own culture and women who are not from their own culture. And there's a lot of, in this environment, it's easy to meet people who are not as educated, people who are only there for the money, people who want to exploit you. And whilst we're talking about victims and about women, it's the same for the men. Even the men who are around these footballers are there to exploit them, and they do not really take care. They do not really cater to these people's needs. Because if I am your pimp, for example, I am looking for you to be interacting with someone I consider safe, at least to a certain level. Do you understand what I'm saying? That I would make you date somebody that I feel is more educated, somebody that might not want a serious or long-term relationship. And I would even say to some of these footballers, why don't you consider online dating sometimes? It can be dangerous, but you can also meet people there who will tell you, look, I'm not into a long-term relationship. I'm into short-term relationships. And, there are different types of relationships that you could have, without exposing yourself to situations like this. So I think it is mainly down to the people that surround you, the people that support you, because these players are human beings. They have emotional needs as well. And if you are a player's agent, you have to support them in every single aspect of their lives, including their emotional life. I think he was in a relationship at the time, possibly with his ex-girlfriend. So this could have been, I do not know what the circumstances of his love life were at that point in time. But usually you would see that some of these players are also at a vulnerable time when these things happen, and they get themselves into these difficulties. So what I would say is the players, agents, and their support system around them really need to help them, especially African players. They really need to help them, because I am yet to see an African player or a player of ethnic minority that has been accused by someone from their community.
Exactly. I will go further. Yeah, I will go further to say that, back in the days, things like, being in a sexual relationship and taking pictures on videotaping it used to be a taboo. But as you said earlier, Neymar, if he did not record his encounter with that lady, he would have been in deep waters right now. So for me, these football players, you should have a safe area. When I talk about a safe area, if you're living in an apartment, make sure that you have videos. You have you record your encounters and stuff like that. And when you have these relationships, make sure that you are having them in your apartment or in your environment, whatever environment you are. But make sure that you keep this information, because these things might be the things that actually saves you. It could be weird, but nowadays these guys are kids in their 20s and all that, so they should be recording these instances.
I would not promote people recording people without their consent. I would not recommend that. What I would only recommend is that you have the right people around you. You socialize in environments where people share values with you. You form relationships that can be trusting. You know the kind of environment you go into to meet people. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
What I'm saying is that it can be a very isolating life as a professional footballer. Every day you train, twice a day, and then you have to play, and then you have a day of rest. That day of rest, your body is knackered. You're sleeping all day. You are in ice baths. You have a little moment to socialize, and you can easily make mistakes. This is why you need the right people around you. And the right people are usually people from your community that understand you, but they need to be the right people as well. Usually if you have family members or brothers or sisters, again, and this is why I say, if you look at the history of these accusations, it doesn't come from people from your community. So what are you thinking? We're not saying you're free to socialize with whoever you are, especially when you want to have a serious relationship. But when you're not thinking about a serious relationship, think very carefully about the environment that you frequent and the people you socialize with, because they do not have your best interest.
That's so true. I mean, we're already at the hour mark. And before we actually do finish, let me actually just read what Ashubi Song said. He says, he was talking about Mason Greenwood. He said charges were pressed in the Greenwood's case. However, the victim stopped cooperating with the CPS. In essence, their key witness was not going to testify. So that's why that case actually died out.
Yeah. I think yes. I think they withdrew from the case. Yes. And in that situation, the case is technically dead, really. So, yeah. And again, understanding the circumstances of that particular case, knowing that charges were pressed, and then the victim did not cooperate, which means they kind of withdrew from the case. You know, that would be one of the reasons specifically why football clubs in the UK would not want to go anywhere near Mason Greenwood.
Okay. So the final comments as we close the show, I would basically just say that this is a very sensitive issue. And those who have been affected, those who know people that have been affected, you know, you make sure you can always relate to the authorities and also learn how to protect yourselves. You know, talk to a friend, talk to your loved ones, and you must always try to get legal advice in these situations, because these are not issues to be taken lightly. Sexual assault, abuse, these things go a long way and they damage people. What do you have to say?
Yes. So if you have listened to this presentation and you have been affected in any way, like I said, I'm based in the UK. Please feel free to contact Rape Crisis in the UK and you would get support. And I think that sexual abuse is a very serious crime and must be taken seriously and responded to in the right way with support from specialists. Seek support at all times and keep yourself safe. Whether you're a footballer or not, keep yourself safe, both male and female.
And for those listening, we are not saying that Thomas Partey is guilty. He's just been accused. Of course, due process has to take place. Thanks for everyone who has been watching. Thank you, Ashubi Song. You're always present to support. Thank you, Mr. Agami. And thank you, Mr. Awa. Any final words?
Thank you, True Lion. Final word, keep watching, keep supporting us, keep sharing, keep subscribing. And we will follow this case to the end to see what the outcome would be. I hope justice is served to everyone involved. Have a great week, guys.
Thank you. You have a wonderful week, my brother.
Okay. Bye.